Hi. As I promised I would do, I have decided to make this video about Lecture 13. This is not a full video like what you're used to. This is just a video where I will walk you through notable aspects and causative agents of the Lecture 13 diseases, which are these. These are respiratory diseases, or diseases of the respiratory system, or diseases that are transmitted through respiratory routes primarily. There's a lot of blurring of this because there are some other diseases that can be transmitted fecal, oral, or respiratory. A lot of diseases are passed through the air that don't affect the lungs. So these classifications don't matter that much, but these are kind of like obviously respiratory. So another thing I've done is I've reordered them and color-coded them. So these bacterial diseases are purple if the causative agent is gram-positive, pink if it's gram-negative. This one's purple again. And then I needed two other colors because the bacterium that causes tuberculosis doesn't stain using the gram stain. It's acid fast. It's just different. And then the one that causes the atypical walking pneumonia is lacking a cell wall completely. So gram stain doesn't work on that either. So I'm making that red. And then the rest of them are caused by viruses. Maybe that will help. So we start with streptococcal pharyngitis. And the causative agent for streptococcal pharyngitis is Streptococcus pyogenes. And you've seen that before. You might stop the video and remind yourself, where have you seen Streptococcus pyogenes before? And what else do we call Streptococcus pyogenes? It's group A strep. Streptococcus pyogenes can do a lot of bad things to people, and bacterial pharyngitis is a very bad sore throat that you get when these bacteria attack your pharynx. Generally speaking, streptococcal pharyngitis is painful, but by itself not super damaging, but there are complications people get, and the complications can be very bad. One of them is scarlet fever, which is a deadly, often, or it used to be very deadly childhood disease people would get after getting streptococcal pharyngitis. Scarlet fever is a disease people can get where the bacteria release a toxin that causes the tongue to swell and it causes skin to turn red. And I don't know how this leads to mortality, but I do know that it used to be a major cause of childhood mortality. So this is a picture of someone with the scarlet fever rash and swollen tongue, but what I really want to draw your attention to is this figure, which shows you the history, the number of cases. Deaths per 100,000 people. Well, 100 deaths per 100,000 people means 1 out of every 1,000 people died this year from scarlet fever. And we can compare that to COVID. At the peak of COVID in Florida had around 4,000, or 400, sorry, per every 100,000. Los Angeles had around 300 per every 100,000 people dying. So you could imagine this as being, at least if it was at this level, 100, not as many people dying as COVID, except that these people who are dying here are all children. This is a disease of children, and this is a long time in the past. This started to go away in the 1880s, and no one knows why. There's no obvious reason. This is not because of antibiotics. Antibiotics came about in the 1940s, by which time scarlet fever was already rare, or at least already not deadly. And these days it's serious, but rarely deadly, partly because of antibiotics. So that's scarlet fever. There's another complication of streptococcal pharyngitis, rheumatic fever, which is an autoimmune disease that attacks the heart and the joints and the brain and the skin. Note that rheumatic fever will not be on the exam. Rheumatic fever is not on your list of diseases, but I can't not tell you about it. The next disease is diphtheria, and this is vaccine preventable, and this is the D in DTaP, or the D in Tdap, or in TD, or the older vaccine that I probably got, DBT, or DT. And the uppercase and lowercase letters here refer to high dose versus low dose. So the childhood vaccine has a high dose of the anti-diphtheria vaccine, a high dose of the anti-tetanus vaccine, and a high dose of the acellular pertussis vaccine. Whereas the booster for older kids has a high dose of tetanus and a low dose of diphtheria and pertussis. And I think this is what adults are supposed to get. I don't know. So it's vaccine preventable, and that's great because it used to, when it was common, form a pseudomembrane that could block someone's airways. And the smaller the airway, the more likely this was to block it and cause death through asphyxiation. So this would happen to children, and this was a deadly childhood disease, and it is very well prevented by these vaccines. And it is caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae, which is gram-positive. Streptococcus pyogenes is also gram-positive. Let's put that up there. Next I want to talk about, well, let's see. Upper respiratory diseases. Upper respiratory viral diseases, because that's the whole thing. These are upper respiratory bacterial diseases. Okay, so upper respiratory bacterial diseases is what I just talked about. Upper respiratory viral diseases are called the common cold. So any virus that attacks your upper respiratory system and stays up there generally causes the same symptoms and signs, because those are all just the innate immune response to upper respiratory viruses. So you get a runny nose, you might get temporary sore throat, you might get swelling in the sinuses, swelling in the nasolacrimal duct, things like that, and eventually you might have a cough. There are 150 to 200 viruses that cause the common cold, and it would be possible to make a vaccine against many of them, but not all of them. So there's just no way to prevent this. The big groups of viruses that cause this are rhinoviruses, adenoviruses, and coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are what get the attention now because of COVID-19. And before 2001, no one thought coronaviruses were serious because they caused the common cold. 2001 is when SARS happened. You'll see that later, and that was a terrifying disease caused by coronavirus. And now, of course, COVID-19 turned the world upside down. So that's all I really want to say about upper respiratory viral diseases. I don't know if you caught my lecture on where the signs and symptoms come from in the common cold, but the take home from that is that they are related to the innate immune response, while it's the adaptive immune response that actually fights off the virus. So the adaptive response is what ends the common cold, but the innate response is what you notice because it gives you the signs and symptoms. The only time you really would notice an adaptive immune response is if it was something really nasty like COVID or influenza, especially influenza, something that makes you feel miserable malaise, something that makes you feel wrong, because that's when the adaptive immune system and helper T cells are releasing signals that make you feel that way. For the most part. This is where pertussis and tuberculosis were supposed to go, but I forgot them, and I talk about them at the end of this video. So look for them there. So now we look at lower respiratory diseases. So we're going to look at some lower respiratory bacterial diseases, and these are pneumonias, because the lower respiratory tract is where the lungs are, and an infection of the lungs is pneumonia. So primary... Why did I say primary? Streptococcal or pneumococcal pneumonia is the first one. So this is the most common serious pneumonia. This is what older people will get after they get influenza. Influenza somehow makes it easier for streptococcus to attack someone's lungs. Influenza is caused by a virus, so it's not related to this at all, but often the streptococcus is in someone's normal microbiota. It's already growing in their airways, not in the lungs, but in the nasal cavity, maybe the upper pharynx, and for whatever reason, influenza allows it to start attacking the lungs. So this is caused by another streptococcus, which is called pneumococcus, which is Streptococcus pneumoniae. Look at the difference in spelling between pneumonia and pneumonia, and don't ever forget it. That's a significant thing, because if you forget that E, you would pronounce it pneumonia instead of pneumonia. So you would be pronouncing the name of a disease instead of the name of a bacterium. So you must remember that E. Atypical or walking pneumonia, I'm sorry, having trouble typing, what are you going to do, is caused by Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which has no cell wall. That means these cells are not very durable in the environment, but they're plenty durable inside a human, where our own cells have no cell walls. So these atypical cause a milder pneumonia generally, and it's just called walking pneumonia because the person with it can walk into a clinic, where someone with pneumococcal pneumonia might not be able to get up and walk around because they'd be much sicker. The last of these bacterial lower respiratory diseases we care about a lot is Legionnaire's disease. This is named after the very first reported outbreak of it, which happened at a convention of the American Legion in Michigan, I believe, in the 90s. And this is caused by bacteria that are named after this, Legionella pneumophila. And Legionella pneumophila grows in a protist. So you might want to stop this and remember, what is a protist? What does it mean to be inside a protist? The protist grows in fresh water. So we get exposed to this when we have stagnant water in a building air supply. The protist grows in it. The bacteria can grow in the protist. And then if that air gets circulated, then that protist and the bacteria are in the air for people to inhale. And this happened in Building 16 when the building was shut down for COVID. Building 16 and several other buildings on LCC's campus were tested for this, because when you shut down the heating of a building and you don't let the water circulate normally, this will happen. And that's something we expect. And so when you know this is coming, you can go test it and make sure you treat it before people come back into the building. And that's what happened. But if this was still something we didn't know about, when they turned on the heat to the building, they turned on the air handling to the building, people with immunosuppression might have gotten atypical pneumonia from this. It's probably been happening for hundreds of years, but the reason we found out about it is because of a convention in a hotel that had an unusually high amount of this in the air, and that convention was of older people with health problems. And so a lot of older people in one place get exposed to a respiratory pathogen, you'll notice it. So that's Legionella and Legionnaire's disease. So now we're on to the lower respiratory viral diseases. And the first one of these is respiratory syncytial virus disease. There is no other name for this. It's just named after the virus that causes it. And it causes, it's caused by the respiratory syncytial virus. It is very risky for babies. So this is the most common cause of pneumonia and might be the most common reason for hospitalization in children under the age of 1. One thing it causes is bronchiolitis. So that is inflammation of the bronchioles. So you can see that's pretty deep in the respiratory system, and that can make it hard to breathe. So someone with RSV has some trouble breathing, and that's one of the signs to look for, like wheezing or an elevated respiration because they're having trouble getting air in and out. So in adults, it's not so serious. It's something like the common cold, though it might affect the lungs. I'm not sure what it does in adults. A disease that deserves its own slide is influenza, which is caused by influenza viruses. There are a lot of different influenza viruses. Mostly we care about influenza A viruses, influenza type A. And that's because they have 8 genome segments. These are like chromosomes. So, if 2 influenza viruses infect the same cell, they can swap chromosomes. This is what sexual reproduction is. And so this gives them the ability to make a brand new version of influenza, and that's what leads to a pandemic strain of influenza. And so the most recent pandemic I'm aware of was in 2009 with H1N1. What does H1N1 mean? There are 2 spike proteins that come in several different major forms. So major mutations lead to these different groups of spike proteins. So there's H, which is hemagglutinin. I think that's how you spell it. You don't have to spell it. You don't have to know the word, but that's H, and it comes in several types. And neuraminidase. I think I also misspelled that. I don't care. Those are the two spike proteins. And they're necessary both to attach and penetrate the cell and also to be released from the cell. And so that's what gives us H1N1, which is type 1 hemagglutinin, type 1 neuraminidase. And the other big one that's circulating right now in 2023 is H3N2. But recently, you'll also probably hear about H5N1. And if you look this up and you look at list of influenza strains that have been circulating, there are a whole bunch of them. But H1N1 is what, it was an H1N1 strain that caused the horrifying pandemic in 1918, and then again in 2009, a different H1N1 strain caused a pandemic in 2009. I got it during that time. A lot of my students, I found out later, had been in high school, and their high schools had shut down. That was when I was in Wisconsin. And that was incredible. I have to tell you, if you've never had influenza before, you're in for a real treat if you ever do. It's not spectacular vomiting like norovirus. It's not explosive diarrhea like other nasty things. It's malaise. It will make you feel wrong in every bone in your body. Everything feels wrong. There's no way to relax, no way to get comfortable, no way to sleep. Just no relief from it for about 5 to 7 days. And partly that happened because I was young and healthy when I got that. Typical influenza strains are really severe for babies and elderly people. But pandemic strains are really bad for healthy young adults who get excessive cytokine production. They get an overactive immune response that makes them feel miserable and in some cases can destroy their lungs. So pandemic strains tend to kill 20-something adults by destroying their lungs, and that's just the immune response to them. Influenza is a big, worthy adversary. So one of the things to put up here is yearly epidemics in winter every year. And remember, influenza is a virus and it mutates quickly, so the flu shot you get to protect you from the 2009 strain of H1N1 will protect you for a few years, but that strain's gonna mutate. And within 5 to 7 years, you're gonna need a different vaccine to protect you from the descendants of that virus. Yeah, so that's the whole thing. There's a related disease that's separate, but it's also caused by influenza. It's highly pathogenic avian influenza. So what is pathogenic? What would be highly pathogenic mean? And I'll tell you, another way to say it that would be better is highly virulent. So what does that mean? That means it's really nasty. It damages a person. And what does avian mean? It means birds. This is bird flu. And the reason we care about bird flu is really recently 3 reasons to care about it. Number 1 is it kills birds. And so farms with ducks and turkeys and chickens, but especially ducks and other water birds, and geese. When they get avian influenza, one of these birds can die in 2 or 3 days. And so if they find a bird with avian influenza, they have to kill the whole flock because there's no way to stop it from spreading, and they don't want it to spread to other birds that fly to a neighboring farm. And so over the last few years, 30 million birds have had to be killed on farms in North America because of bird flu. 30 million birds have been culled. That's when farmers have to kill their stock. Another reason we care about it is because it is severe in humans, but rare. So very rarely this has gotten into a human. And in known cases where it's gotten into a human, it's caused 50% mortality. So you could imagine how scary this is. If you go to work every day around birds that are dying of bird flu, what happens if it gets into you? Do you flip a coin and maybe you live and maybe you die? That's kind of the most severe way to think about this. And the third reason we care so much about it is pandemic potential. Remember what I said about influenza, where if two influenza strains infect the same cell, they can make a new strain? Well, just imagine you are a duck farmer and you go to your farm even though you have influenza and you feel terrible. You're a farmer, so you're tough and you go to work. And your ducks have avian influenza, and you get infected with avian influenza at the same time. It's like winning the lottery. What are the chances? But the real spectacular thing could happen in your cells where somewhere in your epithelium, you make the new pandemic strain. And a pandemic strain of avian influenza would be able to easily spread from person to person, which as so far has not happened. But if this could spread from person to person, it is conceivable that you'd have a disease that spreads faster than COVID, or the same speed as COVID, or a little slower than COVID, but has a 50% mortality rate in adults. We cannot rule this possibility out. This could happen at any time, or it might never happen, but we can see how it could happen. And researchers studying ferrets, which kind of have a similar respiration to us, about 10 years ago, made a series of mutations in bird flu that made it able to hop from ferret to ferret to ferret, which means basically it could hop from person to person to person. So a few mutations would allow this to go from person to person to person. The reason it probably hasn't happened yet is those mutations don't help it in birds. And not many people are up close and personal with birds every day that have bird flu. So hopefully there are other reasons this hasn't happened that we don't know about that are protecting us. But this is potentially the worst thing you could hear about. So let's move on. The worst thing you could hear about if you were a critical care doctor or nurse in Hong Kong in 2001 would be sudden acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. This was scary. It was caused by a virus called SARS-CoV. SARS coronavirus is what caused this. And it is spread by droplets. So remind yourself, what is droplet versus airborne? What does that mean? Droplet spread is when it's only spread in big droplets. And that means people are likely to get it if they're right up close to you, like if they are giving you health care, or if you live in a house with them and talk to them a lot. This can be prevented with masks. It is always symptomatic and usually severe. So everyone who got it had observable signs of illness, including fever. That meant that when this was really spreading around East Asia, very quickly governments installed temperature sensors at airports, so anyone with a fever would be prevented from getting on a plane. This spread fairly slowly, and anyone who had it was obviously sick, which meant that contact tracing and quarantine is what ended the outbreak of SARS. So public health workers were able to end this. Why was it scary? It was scary because it killed doctors and nurses. There is a ward in a hospital, I don't remember where, but they lost a large fraction of the doctors and nurses who were caring for people with this disease. And one thing I want you to look at and think about is, how is this different from COVID? Why were public health workers able to stop SARS, but they couldn't stop COVID? So now let's think about COVID. COVID-19, which is caused by SARS coronavirus 19. That's the name of the virus that causes COVID-19. COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease 2019. That's what it stands for, coronavirus disease 2019, because that's when it was discovered. The main thing I can say about this is I think back to 2020, and as a microbiologist, I was paying attention to everything all the time. I was teaching human anatomy, and I was reading articles about viruses constantly, because this mysterious new disease was spreading so quickly, and nobody knew what it was. We couldn't test for it. We didn't have a vaccine for it. There were no drugs to treat it. And it seemed to have killed a bunch of people in China. And so what I paid attention to was the public health workers trying to stop it. So what were they doing? Trying to do travel bans. They're trying to do contact tracing. They're trying to release phone apps where you could report if you had it. But what we learned very quickly was contact tracing and quarantine did not stop it. So what is different between COVID-19 and SARS? COVID-19 generally is less severe than SARS. Well, major differences include asymptomatic spread. So people can spread COVID-19 without even knowing they have it, and that would never happen with SARS. So the people you have to quarantine if you want to stop COVID-19, you have to find some way of testing everybody, which obviously we didn't have in 2020. We do have now, but even now the home tests give false negatives. So this is a really hard thing to stop. There was never any chance of stopping this virus from spreading. The other thing, well, no, that's really it, asymptomatic spread. COVID-19 has changed the world in a whole lot of very bad ways, but one thing it has done, a silver lining maybe, is that it has really improved our understanding of vaccines, so that virologists and microbiologists and epidemiologists and clinicians really have more sophisticated understanding of what vaccines can do and can't do, and what predictions we can make about a vaccine. And really, immunologists know about vaccines, and immunologists knew that there's a chance these vaccines we got wouldn't stop it from spreading, but would protect us because they would get our cytotoxic T cells up to speed, get our B cells up to speed. But microbiologists and virologists had a kind of simplistic view of vaccines because we were familiar with DTaP and Tdap and MMR, and those are very successful at stopping diseases from spreading. MMR was able to stop measles for years, and that's the most contagious disease there is. But the vaccines for COVID would not stop someone from getting COVID, at least not at a high enough rate to slow it down. but they would protect people because they would get someone's immune response going, and that's much better than nothing, and that saved millions of lives. I missed two. I skipped some diseases I'll go back to in a minute. One thing to know about COVID-19, it is the most deadly infectious disease. Number of people killed worldwide in 2020, 2021, 2022, and I don't know about 2023. So many people care about COVID-19. Okay, so what did I forget to tell you about? I forgot to tell you two things. I forgot to tell you about tuberculosis, which is caused by bacterium, Mycoplasma tuberculosis. That's what causes this, and it, until 2020, it was the most deadly infectious disease. So tuberculosis doesn't have the highest mortality rate, but it's contagious and it gets to a lot of people. And so it kills more people than any other infectious disease, and it has for many, many years. And one thing we can predict is that once COVID is no longer killing as many people, and by 2023 it is not killing as many people as it was in the previous 3 years, tuberculosis will be number one again for the foreseeable future. It is contagious, so it spreads very quickly, and there are 4 stages of the disease. And I think I should add, Mycoplasma tuberculosis is slow growing, therefore slowly killed by antimicrobial drugs. Slowly killed. Which ultimately means people don't take their full course of drugs, and so there are many antimicrobial resistant strains. So there are strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that we cannot treat. The XDR strains, you have to hope a person's immune response will protect them. I want you to learn the stages of tuberculosis. So, TB stages. The first stage is primary TB infection. So, stop the video and remind yourself, what is an infection? So, this is what happens if you catch it. So, there's something like 30% chance a housemate will catch it. Something like that. So there's a good chance someone who lives in your house will catch it from you. And if they do, they get the primary infection. Typically, it leads to latency. And people will get lifelong tuberculosis latency. You might want to stop this and remind yourself, what is latency? If the person is immunosuppressed, so maybe they're maybe they're unhoused and they live in a cold place and their body is very stressed just by living, and they can't fight this off, and they don't successfully trap it in the lungs. So if a person is immunosuppressed, it will progress to primary active TB disease. And this is bad pneumonia with with relatively high mortality. And so this is pneumonia. So this happens in 5% of primary TB infection cases. And this can also lead to latency. Latency is latent tuberculosis infection. And 1 out of every 4 people on Earth have latent TB infection. So that tells you something about how quickly it spreads and why it's able to kill so many people. Because it is everywhere in places where people are close together. The worst stage, generally speaking, is if latency ends. So if it reactivates because of some kind of immunosuppression, some kind of later immunosuppression, like old age or AIDS or something else that damages the immune response in some way. It's called secondary active TB disease. Secondary active TB disease can affect any organ system. Because basically the bacteria have gone into latency where they've been trapped by the immune system somewhere in the body. And wherever they are in the body, if that trapping stops working, they will get out and attack whatever part of the body they're in. So that could be the bones, that could be the brain. And it mimics undiagnosed cancer. So if someone walks into your clinic and your first thought is, shoot, maybe they have some kind of late stage cancer that just has never been caught, there is a chance instead they have secondary active tuberculosis disease. And neither one is good. Because again, it is hard to treat. So what does it mean to slowly killed by antimicrobial drugs? That means treatment involves 2 months of a daily cocktail of antimicrobials. So 2 or 3 antimicrobials every day for at least 2 months. And if you give up on that because you feel better, you can be very confident that the riskies in you will win. So that's terrible. Okay, that's TB. The last disease I want to tell you about today is pertussis. This is caused by Bordetella pertussis. And this is the P in DTaP. TDAP. So the AP is acellular pertussis. It's some part of this bacteria without the whole cell. So it is vaccine preventable. And what it causes is coughing fits, known as paroxysms, followed by forced inhalation, which sounds like a whoop, which gives this the term whooping cough. Well, those coughing fits can lead to vomiting, broken ribs, and incontinence, especially in healthy young people. Very dangerous for babies, as it can lead to trouble breathing. And so Tdap or DTaP is given to people very early because we want to protect them from diphtheria and pertussis, and we want to protect everyone from tetanus. But very young children don't really have good adaptive immune responses. And so this is why anyone who lives in a house with a very young baby should get up to date with their pertussis vaccination. So we don't want to pass this on. So this is vaccine preventable. It is not rare. It still spreads in dormitories. If it's bad enough and people go to the hospital, then they'll report it, because this is a reportable disease in most states. But nobody reports it. I know several people who have told me stories about how sick they were in college, and it's 100% pertussis they had, and they never knew it. So that sucks. So I guess everything sucks. Yeah. That is the moral of this video. Everything sucks. So again, this is the list of diseases. Did we get them all? Yeah. And again, what I was telling you today is notable aspects and causative agents. I didn't really go into signs and symptoms. I didn't usually go into how they spread. I didn't really go into the outcomes in every case. I didn't really talk about treatment or prevention unless it was vaccination. Most of these the bacterial diseases can be treated, but again, I told you, it's hard to treat tuberculosis. Really hard to get people to take those meds every day, especially if they're unhoused and you have to find them to get them to take the meds. And I do have a friend who, she works in a lab doing research on tuberculosis. She puts on a spacesuit and goes into a controlled environment to do her experiments, biosafety level 3. And what she talks about is unhoused people, drug addicts, end up with these horribly drug-resistant tuberculosis strains because they can't easily take the whole drug regimen they're supposed to take. And that just leads to more problems and more problems and more problems. So I don't know what you're going to do with that information, but it's something everyone should know. So that's going to be the end of this video. The next video will be lecture 14, and I will see you there.